November 18, 1944, Camp Carson, Colorado. That crisp autumn afternoon, 73 German prisoners of war stood behind a chain-link fence, witnessing a spectacle their military training had never prepared them for. On a grass field before them, 22 American soldiers were engaged in what appeared to be organized chaos. Men threw themselves at each other with calculated violence, yet when the whistle blew, they stood up, laughed, and prepared to do it again. The Germans had survived the brutality of the Eastern Front and the mechanized warfare of France, but nothing in their experience explained what they were seeing now. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The prisoners, members of the Wehrmacht's 352nd Infantry Division captured during the Normandy breakout, had been in American custody for 4 months. They had witnessed American industrial might, tasted American abundance, and experienced American efficiency. But this afternoon's revelation would fundamentally challenge their understanding of American culture and, more importantly, their assumptions about what made soldiers effective in combat. Oberprefeiter Klaus Hartmann, a decorated veteran of Stalingrad and Normandy, stood at the fence with his hands gripping the wire. At 26 years old, he had commanded a machine gun section through 3 years of brutal warfare. He had seen men die in every conceivable way. He understood violence, strategy, and the psychology of combat. But he could not comprehend what was happening on that football field. "They are preparing for another assault," he muttered to his companion, Feldwebel Ernst Weber, a 32-year-old squad leader from Bavaria. "But why do they stop and reform after each attack? Why do they celebrate when they fail to break through?" Weber, who had fought in Poland, France, and Russia before his capture at Saint-Lô, shook his head slowly. "This is not preparation for combat, Klaus. This is something else entirely, something we do not have." The scene before them seemed paradoxical to German military sensibilities. The American soldiers were divided into 2 teams, identifiable by different colored practice jerseys, one team in faded blue, the other in white. The violence was real enough. Men collided with stunning force, driving each other backward, wrestling for control of an oddly shaped leather ball. Bodies hit the ground hard. The impact sounds carried clearly across the 50 meters separating the POWs from the field. Yet between each violent exchange, the Americans gathered in tight groups, talked animatedly, adjusted their positions, and then lined up to repeat the process. The quarterback, a tall lieutenant with a strong arm, called out incomprehensible codes before each play. His teammates responded with precision, moving in coordinated patterns that reminded Hartmann of infantry tactics, yet served no military purpose he could identify. What disturbed the German prisoners most was not the violence itself, but the joy accompanying it. When a running back broke through the defensive line and sprinted 30 yards before being tackled, both teams erupted in shouts. The tackler helped his opponent to his feet. They exchanged words that seemed friendly, even congratulatory. Then they returned to their positions and immediately tried to hurt each other again. This contradiction defied everything German military culture had taught them. Violence was serious. Combat was not entertainment. Men who fought together formed bonds, but those bonds were forged through shared survival, not through ritualized conflict that everyone seemed to enjoy. The German prisoners had been captured during Operation Cobra, the massive American breakout from Normandy's hedgerow country. The 352nd Infantry Division, already decimated in the initial D-Day fighting, had been overwhelmed by American firepower and coordination during the late July offensive. Most of the POWs at Camp Carson had surrendered when their positions became untenable, their ammunition exhausted, their supply lines severed by American tactical air power. Their journey to Colorado had been enlightening and disturbing in equal measure. The ship that transported them across the Atlantic was larger and better equipped than any vessel in the German Navy. The train that carried them from the East Coast to Colorado moved with a reliability that German military logistics could no longer achieve. The camp itself, constructed specifically to house German and Italian prisoners, was better organized than many German Wehrmacht barracks in Germany. But nothing had prepared them for American football. The game being played before them was a practice scrimmage organized by the camp's American Guards, supplemented by soldiers from the 89th Infantry Division training at nearby Fort Carson. The Americans had invited the German prisoners to watch, apparently believing the spectacle would be entertaining or educational. The Guards had made no attempt to explain the rules, assuming the physical nature of the game would be self-evident. They were wrong. The Germans were utterly confused. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Hartman watched as the blue team quarterback dropped back, protected by 5 large men who formed a pocket around him. The white team's defenders charged forward, trying to break through the protective formation. The quarterback waited, then threw the ball in a perfect spiral 40 yards downfield, where a receiver caught it while running at full speed, only to be immediately hit by 2 defenders who drove him to the ground with bone-jarring force. The Americans cheered. The quarterback raised his arms in triumph. The receiver, who had just been violently tackled, stood up, tossed the ball to a referee, and jogged back to his team, while the defenders who had hit him slapped their backs in celebration.
"They celebrate both the success and the prevention of success," Weber observed, his analytical mind struggling with the contradiction. "The man who threw knows his throw was good. The men who stopped the runner know their defense was good. But they are on opposite sides. How can both be celebrating?" This was the fundamental mystery that the Germans could not solve with their existing framework. In German military culture, combat was zero-sum. Your success meant the enemy's failure. Victory required the enemy's defeat. The idea that both sides could find satisfaction in a single exchange was incomprehensible. What the German prisoners were witnessing, though they lacked the context to understand it, was the foundational element of American competitive culture. American football, developed over the previous 70 years from rugby and soccer, had become the quintessential expression of American values: aggressive individualism within coordinated team structure, celebration of both physical dominance and tactical intelligence, and the transformation of controlled violence into entertainment and character development. The game had evolved significantly since its brutal beginnings in the 1800s. By 1944, football had become deeply embedded in American culture, particularly in military training. Nearly every American soldier at Camp Carson had played football in high school or college. For them, the game was not just entertainment, it was a language. A shared experience that created bonds and taught lessons considered essential for military effectiveness. But the Germans knew none of this history. They saw only the surface, organized violence that everyone seemed to enjoy. Captain Robert Mitchell, the American officer supervising the practice, noticed the German prisoners' intense interest. Mitchell, a former college football player from Ohio State University, had been wounded at Anzio and now served as the camp's recreation officer while recovering. He walked over to the fence, curious about the prisoners' reactions. "You men understand American football?" he asked in passable German, learned from his immigrant grandparents. Hartman, who spoke some English, responded carefully. "We understand that it is a game, but we do not understand why soldiers would play such a game, or how this," he gestured at the field, searching for words, "this organized violence creates discipline." Mitchell smiled. He had encountered this confusion before with other German prisoners. "It's not about discipline the way you think of discipline. It's about learning to function as a team while each man pushes himself to his limit. It's about controlled aggression. It's about learning that you can hit a man as hard as you can, and 5 seconds later, you're helping him up because the play is over." Hartman translated for the other prisoners. The explanation created more confusion than clarity. In Wehrmacht training, violence was always purposeful, always directed toward military objectives. The idea of violence as character development, as team building, as something that could be turned on and off with a whistle, this was alien. Weber asked a question in German, which Hartmann translated. But how does this help in real combat? In battle, you do not stop when a whistle blows. The enemy does not help you to your feet. How does this game prepare men for war? Mitchell considered the question carefully. It was more insightful than most Americans would have asked. It doesn't prepare you for war the way your training does. It prepares you differently. It teaches you that you can take a hit and get back up. It teaches you to trust the men on your line to protect you. It teaches you to think under pressure while people are trying to hurt you. And maybe most importantly, it teaches you that aggressive competition doesn't have to create permanent enemies. This answer, when translated, was met with skeptical silence from the German prisoners. Their experience suggested otherwise. Aggressive competition had created very permanent enemies indeed. The practice continued, and gradually the Germans began to discern patterns in the chaos. They recognized that the two teams were attempting different objectives, one trying to advance the ball, the other trying to stop that advance. They understood that certain positions had specific roles, much like infantry tactics. The quarterback was like a squad leader directing the action. The large men protecting him were like supporting troops. The fast runners were like assault troops, trying to exploit gaps in the enemy line. But the more they understood the tactical elements, the more confused they became about the purpose. This was clearly not training for actual combat. The movements were stylized, the objectives arbitrary. Yet the Americans played with an intensity that suggested deep meaning. One play particularly captured the Germans' attention. The blue team's quarterback called signals, received the ball, and attempted to hand it to a running back. But the exchange was fumbled. The ball fell to the ground. Immediately, both teams converged on the loose ball in a chaotic pile of bodies. When the referee finally pulled players off the pile, the white team had recovered the ball. The Germans expected the blue team to be devastated by this failure. Instead, the quarterback immediately gathered his teammates, spoke quickly to them, and they jogged to the sideline where they began discussing what went wrong. There was no punishment, no visible anger, just immediate analysis and adjustment. They treat failure as information, Hartmann observed quietly, not as shame. This was perhaps the most culturally significant observation of the afternoon, though Hartmann did not yet realize it. German military culture, particularly as it had evolved under National Socialism, treated failure as a moral deficiency requiring punishment. American culture, as expressed through football, treated failure as a learning opportunity requiring analysis. The practice concluded with the white team scoring what the Americans called a touchdown, carrying the ball across a line at the end of the field. Both teams gathered at midfield, and to the Germans' continued amazement, shook hands, slapped backs, and walked off the field together, laughing about various plays. Captain Mitchell returned to the fence. "What did you think?" Hartmann spoke carefully, aware that he was a prisoner commenting on his captor's culture. "It is interesting. We do not have anything like this in Germany. We have sport, of course, football, what you call soccer. But this is different. This seems to combine sport with military training, but also with entertainment." "That's exactly right," Mitchell confirmed. "Football is all of those things, but it's more than that. It's how we teach young men to be aggressive and controlled at the same time. How we teach them that you can compete fiercely against someone and still respect them. That's something we're going to need when this war is over." The implications of this statement were not lost on the German prisoners. Mitchell was suggesting that Americans were already thinking about the post-war world, about reconciliation, about moving beyond the enmities that war created.
This long-term thinking, this assumption of eventual victory and subsequent peace, was itself revealing about American psychology. As the prisoners were marched back to their barracks for the evening meal, the conversation was animated. The football game had provoked more discussion than anything else they had witnessed in American captivity. Various theories were proposed about the game's purpose, its cultural significance, and what it revealed about American military effectiveness. Gefreite Heinrich Müller, a former school teacher from Hamburg, Germany, offered the most insightful analysis. "I think we are seeing something fundamental about how Americans think about conflict. For us, conflict is existential. It is about survival, about victory or death, about the strong defeating the weak. For them, conflict is developmental. It is how they test themselves, improve themselves, prepare themselves. The game ends, but the players remain. The competition is intense, but it is not permanent." This observation touched on something the Germans had noticed repeatedly during their captivity. American guards were professional but not cruel. They enforced rules but allowed considerable autonomy. They seemed to view the Germans not as permanent enemies, but as temporarily defeated opponents who would eventually need to be reintegrated into civilized society. This attitude was incomprehensible to men raised in a culture where enemies were demonized, where racial hierarchies determined human worth, where total victory or total defeat were the only imaginable outcomes. The Americans seemed to lack this absolutism. They fought fiercely. The Germans knew this from brutal experience, but they did not seem to hate personally. They could bomb your city to rubble in the afternoon and offer you a cigarette in the evening. Football, the Germans were beginning to realize, was somehow key to understanding this paradox. That night in the barracks, the discussion continued. Otto Schneider, a former Hitler Youth leader who remained ideologically committed despite capture, argued that football revealed American weakness. They cannot commit fully to victory. They must make even war into a game. This is why they needed British, Canadian, and Russian help to defeat us. They lack the will for total war. But Hartmann disagreed, his combat experience providing different insights. "No, Otto. Think about what we saw today. Those men were hitting each other with full force. There was nothing held back in the physical contact. But they could turn it on and off instantly when the whistle blew. This is not weakness, this is control. They can be as violent as necessary, but they are not consumed by it. They do not lose themselves in it." This debate, whether American football culture represented weakness or strength, would continue throughout the prisoners' captivity. But Hartmann's interpretation was closer to the truth. What the Germans had witnessed was the physical expression of a cultural value system that prioritized controlled aggression, team coordination, and the ability to compete intensely without permanent enmity. The historical context of this encounter was significant. By November 1944, the outcome of World War II was effectively decided. Germany was fighting a defensive war on two fronts, with diminishing resources and collapsing logistics. German POWs in American camps numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and more arrived daily. For the Americans, POW camps served multiple purposes beyond simple detention. They were opportunities to demonstrate American values, to show that the United States fought according to rules and treated prisoners humanely. They were also early efforts in what would later be called denazification, exposing German soldiers to American culture, democracy, and ways of thinking that contradicted Nazi ideology. Football games were part of this larger strategy, though most American guards probably didn't think about it in such terms. They simply wanted to play football, enjoyed showing off American culture, and found the German prisoners' confusion entertaining. But the cumulative effect was significant. German POWs were consistently exposed to a culture that was simultaneously more individualistic and more democratic than their own, that celebrated competition without eliminating compassion, that could be fierce in war and generous in victory. Camp Carson, where this particular encounter occurred, held approximately 9,000 prisoners by late 1944. The camp was well organized, with prisoners divided by rank and political affiliation. Hardcore Nazis were separated from non-political soldiers. Officers were housed separately from enlisted men. The Americans had learned that mixing these groups created problems. Nazi loyalists intimidated or attacked prisoners who showed any friendliness toward American culture.
Hartmann and his comrades were housed in a section designated for non-political enlisted prisoners, men who had fought for Germany but were not ideologically committed to National Socialism. These prisoners were considered most likely to benefit from exposure to American culture, most likely to return to Germany after the war as potential builders of a democratic future. The football game they had witnessed was not unique to Camp Carson. Similar scenes played out at POW camps across the United States throughout 1944 and 1945. American guards, often young men themselves who missed playing football, organized games whenever possible. They invited prisoners to watch, partly for entertainment, partly to demonstrate American culture, partly from a vague sense that understanding football was somehow important to understanding America. They were right, though most could not have articulated why. In the days following that first football game, Hartmann found himself thinking repeatedly about what he had witnessed. His analytical mind, trained in military tactics, recognized that football contained genuine strategic elements. The offense was trying to advance through enemy territory. The defense was trying to stop that advance. There were formations, feints, exploitation of weaknesses, coordination of multiple moving parts. It was, in some ways, warfare in miniature. But it was also something more. The game created a space where men could test themselves against each other with real physical force, experience real competition and conflict, yet maintain relationships beyond that conflict. This seemed to be the key insight that American culture had developed and German culture lacked. German military training emphasized unity and obedience. Soldiers were taught to subsume individual desires for collective goals. Personal initiative was valued only within strict hierarchical structures. Aggression was channeled toward designated enemies who were dehumanized to make killing psychologically easier. There was no cultural mechanism for controlled, temporary, bounded conflict that created respect rather than enmity. American football provided exactly that mechanism. Boys learned from age 12 or younger that you could hit your neighbor's son as hard as possible on the field, then help him with homework that evening. Competition was intense but temporary. Aggression was real but controlled. Violence was physical but not personal. This cultural difference had military implications that the Germans were only beginning to understand. American soldiers had grown up navigating complex social dynamics where competition and cooperation coexisted. They were comfortable with fluid hierarchies where leadership emerged from demonstrated competence rather than fixed rank. They could adapt to changing circumstances because they had spent years learning to adjust tactics based on an opponent's strategies. German soldiers, by contrast, excelled within clear hierarchies and established plans, but struggled when command structures broke down or when flexibility was required. This was one reason why American forces had proven so effective after initial inexperience. American soldiers at every level could improvise, could take initiative, could coordinate without explicit orders, all skills developed on football fields across America. As autumn turned to winter at Camp Carson, more football games were played and more German prisoners watched with growing comprehension. Captain Mitchell, recognizing the prisoners' interest, began providing basic explanations of the rules. Some prisoners even began discussing tactics and analyzing plays, applying their military training to understanding this strange American game.
The cultural revelation continued to unfold. The Germans learned that football was not just a military training tool, but a central part of American life. High schools across America had football teams. Universities competed in massive stadiums before tens of thousands of spectators. Professional leagues existed where men were paid to play this violent game. The best players became national celebrities, their achievements discussed as seriously as military victories. This elevation of sport to cultural centrality was foreign to German prisoners. Germany had sports, of course, soccer, track and field, gymnastics, but these were either entertainment or physical training, not cultural touchstones that taught life lessons and created shared identity. The idea that a game could be that significant seemed peculiar. Yet, as the Germans learned more about America through conversations with guards, through American newspapers available in the camp, through exposure to American media, they began to understand that football was genuinely central to how Americans understood themselves. The game's values, aggressive competition within rules, individual excellence within team structure, controlled violence, respect for opponents, immediate recovery from failure, these were American values generally. The war in Europe ground toward its inevitable conclusion. By December 1944, Germany's last offensive, the Battle of the Bulge, was being prepared. German prisoners at Camp Carson learned about it through delayed news reports, holding hope that perhaps the tide could be turned, but most, including Hartmann, knew the war was lost. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but what would come after. This made the cultural lessons of football increasingly relevant. If Germany was to be rebuilt after defeat, what model would it follow? The Americans seemed confident that democracy and American values would prevail. The football games suggested how those values might be transmitted, not through force or propaganda, but through cultural practices that embodied American assumptions about conflict, competition, and community. As the year ended and 1945 began, the football season concluded, replaced by basketball games that the Germans found equally confusing but less viscerally impressive. The brutality of football, its controlled violence, had made a particular impact. Basketball seemed tame by comparison, though it too demonstrated American comfort with aggressive competition within defined rules. The revelation that American football represented would continue to unfold throughout the prisoners' captivity and beyond. Some Germans, like Hartmann, would return to post-war Germany with a new understanding of American culture and values. Others, like Otto Schneider, would dismiss what they had seen as proof of American superficiality and lack of seriousness.
But all had been changed by the experience of watching American soldiers play football with joy and violence in equal measure, demonstrating a cultural capability the German society lacked. The ability to fight fiercely without permanent hatred, to compete intensely without permanent enmity, to channel aggression constructively rather than destructively. This was the hidden advantage that American soldiers carried into battle, not just superior equipment or industrial capacity, but a cultural formation that prepared them for both conflict and peace, for both competition and cooperation, for both individual excellence and team success. Football was the visible expression of that cultural advantage, as decisive in its own way as any weapon system. The German prisoners standing at that fence on November 18, 1944, were witnessing something more significant than a game. They were seeing the cultural engine that powered American society, the mechanism that would enable America to fight a total war without becoming a totalitarian society, to achieve military victory without sacrificing democratic values. They did not fully understand what they were seeing. How could they? But they knew they were witnessing something important, something that helped explain why the Americans had proven so effective in combat despite their initial inexperience, something that suggested what the post-war world might look like if American values prevailed. The football game continued its revelations long after the final whistle blew.
The great irony of what German prisoners witnessed at Camp Carson in late 1944 was that Germany had actually pioneered the concept of physical training as military preparation. Friedrich Ludwig Jahn, the father of gymnastics, had developed systematic physical education in Prussia during the early 1800s specifically to prepare young men for military service. The Turnverein movement he created spread across Germany, establishing gymnastics clubs that combined physical training with nationalist ideology. By the 1930s, German physical education was considered the world's most advanced. The 1936 Berlin Olympics showcased German athletic prowess and organizational capability. Nazi ideology elevated physical fitness to a central component of racial theory. German youth were subjected to rigorous physical training from early childhood, preparing them for eventual military service. Yet Germany had failed to develop what America had created almost accidentally, a cultural practice that combined physical violence, strategic thinking, team coordination, and character development into a single activity that the entire society embraced. Germany had gymnastics, soccer, and military drill. America had football, and that difference mattered more than most military strategists realized. Feldwebel Ernst Weber understood this irony better than most. Before the war, he had been a physical education instructor at a gymnasium in Munich. He had taught the German sports curriculum, gymnastics, track and field, soccer, and military-style calisthenics. He had believed that German physical education was superior to any system in the world. Now, watching American soldiers play football repeatedly throughout the winter of 1944 to 45, Weber recognized that Germany's systematic approach had missed something crucial. German physical training produced obedient, physically capable soldiers. American football produced adaptable, aggressive, coordinated team players who could think under pressure. "We trained bodies," Weber explained to Hartmann during one of their many discussions about football. "They trained decision-makers. Every player on that field is constantly reading the situation, adjusting to changes, making split-second choices. Our training taught men to follow orders perfectly. Their game teaches men to make good decisions when orders are impossible." This distinction had profound military implications that were becoming clear as more information about the war's final campaigns reached Camp Carson. American units consistently demonstrated an ability to maintain cohesion and effectiveness even when command structures were disrupted. German units, by contrast, often became ineffective when their officers were killed or communications were severed. The statistics told a compelling story. By early 1945, the United States had approximately 12 million men under arms. Of these, an estimated 9 million, 75%, had played organized football at some level before military service. High school football programs existed in virtually every American community, with a population over 5,000. College football had become a national obsession, with major universities fielding teams that drew crowds of 50,000 or more. This meant that the vast majority of American soldiers entering combat had spent years learning the lessons football taught: aggressive competition within rules, instant adaptation to changing situations, trust in teammates, controlled violence, and the ability to take devastating hits and immediately recover. These lessons had been internalized through thousands of hours of practice and gameplay, becoming instinctive rather than intellectual. Germany, despite its emphasis on physical training, had no equivalent. German soldiers were physically fit and tactically competent, but their training emphasized obedience over initiative, hierarchy over flexibility, and predetermined plans over improvisation. When conditions matched the plan, German forces were formidable. When conditions diverged from the plan, they struggled. The scale of American football culture was truly remarkable. In 1944 alone, approximately 600,000 American high school students played organized football. Another 150,000 played at the college level. Professional football, though less culturally dominant than it would become later, already had established leagues and devoted followings. This meant that the vast majority of American military units were filled with men who shared a common cultural language. A sergeant from Texas and a private from Ohio might have different backgrounds, but they had both played football. They understood concepts like blocking for your teammate, reading the defense, adjusting the play at the line, and taking one for the team. These shared concepts facilitated communication and coordination in ways that military training alone could not achieve. German prisoners at Camp Carson witnessed this coordination repeatedly as they observed not just football games, but the daily interactions of American soldiers. The Americans seemed to operate with an informal efficiency that contrasted with German military formality. Orders were given, but also discussed. Plans were made, but also adjusted based on input from lower ranks. Hierarchy existed, but was less rigid than German structures.
Gefreiter Heinrich Müller, the former schoolteacher, spent considerable time analyzing these differences. He began writing observations in a notebook, smuggled materials that he hoped to bring back to Germany after the war. His February 1945 entry captured the essential insight. The Americans have created a society where competitive violence is channeled into structured activities that teach cooperation. Their football is not just a game, it is a training system for their entire culture. From age 12, boys learn to be aggressive and controlled, competitive and cooperative, individual and team-oriented simultaneously. By the time they become soldiers, these lessons are so deeply ingrained that they operate automatically. This gives them an enormous advantage in the chaos of modern warfare, where rigid hierarchies and predetermined plans often fail. As winter turned to spring in 1945, the news from Europe became increasingly grim for the German prisoners. The Battle of the Bulge had failed. Soviet forces were advancing rapidly from the east. American and British forces were crossing the Rhine. Germany's defeat was now not just probable, but imminent. The prisoners at Camp Carson responded to this news in various ways. Hardcore Nazis retreated into denial or conspiracy theories. Political prisoners felt vindicated. Most ordinary soldiers simply felt resignation and concern about what awaited them in defeated Germany. But the football games continued, and with them the cultural education of German POWs. By March 1945, some prisoners were being allowed to participate in athletics under American supervision. Not football, that was considered too complex and too culturally specific, but soccer, which the Germans knew well. Yet even these soccer matches revealed cultural differences. American guards who played soccer with the prisoners approached the game with a football mentality. They were more physical than European soccer tradition dictated, more willing to engage in aggressive contact, more focused on winning through force rather than finesse. The Germans, skilled soccer players, initially dominated through superior technique, but over time, the Americans' aggressive approach began to pay dividends. They might lack the Germans' technical skills, but their willingness to compete physically, developed through years of football, made them formidable opponents. Hartmann, playing in one of these matches, experienced a revelation. An American guard, a corporal from Michigan who had played college football, challenged him for the ball with a shoulder-to-shoulder collision that sent Hartmann sprawling. It was legal within soccer rules, but far more physical than European play typically allowed. When Hartmann stood up ready to protest, the American was already extending a hand to help him up while simultaneously grinning competitively. "Good try, Jerry, but you're going to have to be tougher than that."
The message was clear. Aggression was respected, physical contact was expected, but it was all part of the game, not personal animosity. This encapsulated the football mentality that permeated American military culture. The psychological impact of American football culture extended beyond tactical considerations. American soldiers seemed to carry a confidence that German soldiers had lost, if they have ever had it. American troops believed they would win not because their leaders told them to believe it, but because they had a lifetime of experience winning through coordinated effort, aggressive execution, and adaptation to challenges. This confidence was visible in how American guards at Camp Carson interacted with German prisoners. They were not cruel, but neither were they sympathetic. They had a job to do, and they did it efficiently. They seemed to view the Germans as defeated opponents rather than hated enemies, much as a football team might view the team they defeated last Saturday. The game was over, they had won, time to move on. This attitude was profoundly different from what German prisoners had expected based on their own military culture. German soldiers who fought on the Eastern Front had witnessed and participated in a war of annihilation, where defeated enemies were often executed or left to die. German propaganda had warned that Americans would treat German prisoners with similar brutality. Instead, German prisoners at Camp Carson were fed adequately, housed in decent conditions, provided with medical care, and treated with procedural correctness, if not warmth. This created cognitive dissonance. How could the Americans fight so effectively yet harbor so little hatred? How could they be so casual about victory? Football provided the answer. Americans had grown up learning that you could compete fiercely against someone Saturday afternoon and be friendly with them Saturday evening. The competition was real, the violence was genuine, but it was bounded, limited to the field, limited to the duration of the game. This cultural capability allowed Americans to fight total war without becoming totalitarian, to achieve military victory without losing their democratic values. The spring of 1945 brought increasing evidence of American industrial and logistical superiority. Prisoners working in camp maintenance noticed the abundance of everything: food, medicine, equipment, vehicles. Nothing was scarce, nothing was rationed beyond what military protocol required. The Americans operated with a material lavishness that Germany had never achieved even at the height of its power. But the football games suggested that American advantages ran deeper than industrial capacity. The culture that produced football also produced the organizational flexibility, innovative thinking, and individual initiative that made American forces so effective. The same society that could organize thousands of high school football programs could organize global military logistics. The same culture that encouraged quarterbacks to read defenses and adjust plays encouraged junior officers to assess situations and take initiative. Otto Schneider, the former Hitler Youth leader, remained resistant to these observations. In his view, football proved that Americans were frivolous, that they could not take anything seriously, that they would ultimately lack the will to maintain their victory. He predicted that American occupation of Germany would be temporary, that American soldiers would tire of their duties and demand to go home, that American culture was too individualistic to sustain long-term commitment.
Time would prove him wrong, but in spring 1945, his views were not uncommon among German prisoners. Many could not accept that a culture that played games could defeat a culture that worshipped strength and power. On April 12, 1945, news reached Camp Carson that President Franklin Roosevelt had died. The German prisoners expected chaos, perhaps even celebration among the Americans. Instead, they witnessed something that again challenged their understanding: genuine grief combined with seamless continuity of government. American guards mourned their commander-in-chief, but there was no crisis, no power struggle,
no uncertainty about succession. Vice President Truman became president, and American society continued functioning without interruption. This demonstrated another aspect of American culture that football both reflected and reinforced. The institution was more important than any individual. Football teams survived the graduation of star players. American democracy survived the death of its leader. Both systems had depth, redundancy, and cultural practices that maintained continuity regardless of individual changes. German political culture, by contrast, had become entirely dependent on a single leader. With Hitler's death imminent, it would occur on April 30. German society had no mechanism for orderly transition. The entire system had been built around one man's will. When he was gone, the system would collapse. May 8, 1945, VE Day. The war in Europe officially ended. At Camp Carson, American guards celebrated while German prisoners absorbed the reality of total defeat. The Third Reich, promised to last 1,000 years, had lasted 12. Germany was occupied, divided, devastated. The question was no longer whether Germany would be defeated, but what form its reconstruction would take. Captain Mitchell organized a special event for VE Day, a full-scale football game between two American teams with German prisoners invited to watch. By now, after 6 months of observation, the Germans understood the rules and could appreciate the tactical complexity. What had once seemed like organized chaos now appeared as coordinated strategy. Hartmann watched this VE Day game with new understanding. He could see how the offense tried to exploit defensive weaknesses, how the defense adjusted to counter offensive strategies, how individual heroics were balanced against team discipline. He recognized patterns from military tactics, feints, concentration of force, exploitation of gaps, coordination of timing. But more than the tactical elements, Hartmann now understood the cultural function. This game, played on the day of Germany's defeat, was not just entertainment. It was a reaffirmation of American values. The game said, "We are a people who can be violent and civilized, aggressive and principled, competitive and cooperative. We can defeat our enemies without becoming what we fought against." The post-war period brought new dynamics to Camp Carson. Some German prisoners would be repatriated quickly. Others would remain in American custody for months or years, particularly those with useful skills or those deemed most likely to support democratic reconstruction in Germany. Hartmann, with his combat experience but non-political background, was selected for an experimental program, Education in Democratic Principles Before Repatriation. This program included intensive exposure to American culture, history, and values, and inevitably, it included more football. By summer 1945, some German prisoners were being taught to play the game themselves. Not with the intensity of American players, that would take years of cultural immersion, but enough to understand its lessons experientially rather than just observationally. Hartmann's first attempt to play football was humbling. Despite his physical fitness and military training, he found himself overwhelmed by the game's complexity. He had to learn to read the opposing team's formation, adjust his position based on the play called, execute his assignment while reacting to unexpected developments, and do all this while large men tried to knock him down. After one particularly brutal play where he was blindsided by a blocker he never saw coming, Hartmann lay on the ground trying to catch his breath. An American guard, the same corporal from Michigan, reached down to help him up. "You gotta keep your head on a swivel, Klaus. Can't focus on just one thing. Gotta see the whole field." Hartmann realized this was exactly the lesson American soldiers had learned from thousands of hours of football. Maintain situational awareness while executing your assignment. trust your teammates to handle their responsibilities, adapt instantly to changing conditions, and never stop moving forward just because you took a hit. These were the skills that had made American forces so effective in the war's final campaigns. These were the capabilities German military training had failed to develop, and they had been taught not through military doctrine, but through a game that American boys played for fun. The statistics of American football's cultural penetration were staggering when examined comprehensively. American football participation in 1944. High school players, 600,000. College players, 150,000. Professional players, 3,500. Total active players, 753,500. Former players in military service, approximately 9 million. Percentage of U.S. servicemen with football experience, 75%. German comparable activities, organized youth sports participants, approximately 2 million. Military-style physical training, universal in Hitler Youth. Team sports, emphasizing coordination and aggression, minimal. Cultural activities teaching bounded violence and respect for opponents, none. Percentage of the Wehrmacht with experience in coordinated competitive violence as character development, essentially 0%. The numbers revealed the magnitude of the cultural difference. America had, largely without conscious intent, created a nationwide system that prepared young men for the psychological and tactical demands of modern warfare. Germany, despite its emphasis on military preparedness, had no equivalent. Soviet evaluators who examined American POW camps after the war reached similar conclusions. A 1946 Soviet intelligence report noted, American military effectiveness derives not only from industrial capacity, but from cultural practices that develop initiative, coordination, and aggressive confidence. Their game of football appears to serve functions that combine physical training, tactical education, and psychological conditioning. No comparable practice exists in Soviet or German culture.
The report recommended that Soviet sports programs be reformed to emphasize team coordination and controlled aggression. However, attempts to introduce American-style football in the Soviet Union failed. The cultural context necessary for the game to function as character development, individualism balanced with team loyalty, competition without permanent enmity, violence bounded by rules and referees, was incompatible with Soviet collectivist ideology. As 1945 turned to 1946, German prisoners at Camp Carson began the long process of repatriation. Hartmann was among those who returned to Germany in early 1946, arriving in a country he barely recognized. Cities were rubble, infrastructure was destroyed, society was in chaos. The question of how to rebuild Germany, and as what kind of society, dominated all discussions. Hartmann carried with him memories of American football games, of cultural lessons learned behind a chain-link fence in Colorado. He had witnessed a society that could channel human aggression constructively, that could compete intensely without permanent hatred, that could fight total war without losing democratic values. These lessons would influence how he thought about Germany's future. In the immediate post-war period, American occupation authorities attempted to introduce American sports, including football, to German youth. These efforts had limited success. Football required extensive equipment, large playing fields, and cultural context that Germany lacked. But the underlying principles, bounded competition, controlled aggression, team coordination, respect for opponents, these were values that American occupiers tried to instill through various means. The modern German Bundeswehr, established in 1955, incorporated some of these lessons. Unlike the Wehrmacht, the Bundeswehr emphasized individual initiative and flexible response over rigid obedience.
officers were trained to encourage subordinates to think independently and adapt to changing situations. The concept of Auftragstaktik, mission-type tactics, that had existed in German military theory but was often contradicted in practice, was revived and genuinely implemented. These reforms reflected lessons learned from defeat. German military analysts studying American effectiveness in World War II consistently noted American soldiers' ability to maintain unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness even when command structures were disrupted. The analysts attributed this to American cultural practices that developed initiative and coordination from childhood. Football was specifically mentioned in several Bundeswehr training documents as an example of how cultural activities could support military effectiveness. The 1991 Gulf War provided dramatic validation of the principles that football embodied. Coalition forces, dominated by American military culture, faced an Iraqi army equipped with Soviet weapons and trained in Soviet doctrine. On paper, Iraqi forces had numerical advantages and defensible positions. In practice, they were destroyed with minimal coalition casualties. American forces demonstrated precisely the capabilities that German POWs had observed in 1944-45: seamless coordination across large distances, instant adaptation to changing tactical situations, effective use of information superiority, and individual initiative at every level. Iraqi forces, trained in rigid hierarchical systems similar to the Wehrmacht, could not compete when their command structures were disrupted by coalition air attacks. Military analysts worldwide noted that the Gulf War demonstrated the superiority of network-centric warfare over platform-centric warfare, of flexible response over rigid doctrine, of empowered individuals over obedient soldiers. These were the same advantages American football culture had provided in World War II, now amplified by modern technology, but still rooted in cultural practices that developed individual initiative within team structures. The story of German POWs witnessing American football in 1944-45 represents more than an interesting historical anecdote. It illustrates a fundamental truth about warfare and competition generally. Cultural advantages often prove more decisive than material advantages. Germany had superior tanks, superior tactics, and initially superior military experience. But America had a culture that prepared every citizen for the psychological and social demands of modern warfare, largely through a game those citizens played for entertainment. This cultural advantage was invisible to most observers. German intelligence thoroughly analyzed American weapons, logistics, and tactics. But they never recognized that American effectiveness stemmed partly from childhood experiences on football fields, from lessons about controlled aggression, team coordination, and bounded competition that had nothing to do with military training, but everything to do with military effectiveness. The lesson applies beyond military contexts. In business competition, technological innovation, political organization, in any domain where coordination and adaptation matter, cultural practices that develop relevant capabilities from childhood provide enormous advantages. These advantages are difficult to copy because they are embedded in thousands of informal practices and assumptions, not informal systems that can be studied and replicated. Modern corporations increasingly recognize this principle. Companies like Google and Amazon explicitly try to create cultures that encourage initiative, experimentation, and coordinated innovation, values that American football culture has promoted for over a century. The business world's current emphasis on agile methods, flat hierarchies, and empowered teams reflect principles that Americans learned on football fields long before these became management buzzwords. The electromagnetic waves that connected American Sherman tanks in World War II have evolved into the digital networks that connect modern military forces. But the cultural foundation remains the same. Individuals trained from childhood to think independently while coordinating with teams, to compete aggressively while respecting opponents, to adapt instantly to changing conditions while maintaining focus on objectives. German prisoners standing at that fence in November 1944 were witnessing the future of human competition, not just in warfare, but in all domains where coordination and adaptation determine success. They did not fully understand what they were seeing, but the most perceptive among them recognized that America possessed an advantage that went deeper than industrial capacity or weapons technology. Ernst Weber, the former physical education instructor, captured this insight in a letter he wrote to his wife in early 1946 after his return to Germany.
We trained our boys to be soldiers. The Americans trained their boys to be men who could become soldiers when necessary. We emphasized obedience and strength. They emphasized initiative and coordination. We created specialists who excelled within their designated roles. They created adaptable thinkers who could fill any role required. This difference, more than any advantage in weapons or numbers, determined the war's outcome. As we rebuild Germany, we must understand that the rigid hierarchies and unquestioning obedience we once valued are obsolete. The future belongs to societies that can combine individual initiative with collective purpose, competition with cooperation, aggression with principle. The Americans learned these lessons on their football fields. We must find our own path to the same destination. Weber became an educator in post-war Germany, advocating for reforms that emphasized critical thinking and individual development. His efforts contributed to the transformation of German education from its authoritarian pre-war model to the more flexible system that emerged in West Germany during the 1950s and 1960s. Hartmann took a different path. He became involved in the economic reconstruction of Germany, eventually starting a manufacturing business that applied American management principles, empowering workers, encouraging suggestions from all levels, maintaining flexible response to market changes. His company prospered during Germany's economic miracle of the 1950s and 1960s, partly because he had learned from American culture that rigid hierarchies were less effective than flexible coordination. Both men carried with them memories of those football games at Camp Carson, of the cultural revelation they had experienced as defeated soldiers watching their victorious enemies play a violent game with joy and discipline in equal measure. These memories influenced how they thought about Germany's future and their role in building it. The story comes full circle in modern Germany. American football, while never achieving the popularity of soccer, has found a niche in German sports culture. The German Football League, established in 1979, represents Europe's strongest American football organization outside the United States. German players have even competed in the NFL. More significantly, German military and business culture has absorbed many of the principles that football embodies, even without directly adopting the game. The Bundeswehr's emphasis on innere Führung, or inner leadership, encourages soldiers to think ethically and independently, to question orders that seem immoral, and to take initiative within mission guidelines. These principles reflect lessons learned from defeat in World War II, lessons that included observations about American soldiers' initiative and flexibility, capabilities developed partly through cultural practices like football. German businesses, particularly in technology and manufacturing sectors, increasingly adopt organizational structures that emphasize team coordination, flexible response, and empowered workers. The rigid hierarchies that characterized German business culture in the early 20th century have given way to more adaptive models. While multiple factors drove this transformation, American cultural influence was significant, and football represented a visible symbol of American organizational principles. The philosophical conclusion emerging from this history is profound. The most decisive advantages in human competition are often invisible. Material factors, weapons, resources, infrastructure, are easy to observe and measure.
Cultural factors, values, practices, assumptions embedded in childhood experiences are difficult to recognize and impossible to quickly replicate. American football provided invisible advantages that proved more decisive than visible superiority in tanks or aircraft. The game taught millions of American boys lessons about coordination, initiative, controlled aggression, and bounded competition. These lessons created a military force that could maintain effectiveness under conditions that paralyzed forces trained in more rigid systems. German prisoners at Camp Carson were witnessing the cultural engine that powered American military success. Most did not understand what they were seeing. Those who did understand faced the challenge of explaining an insight that seemed trivial. How could a game matter more than weapons or tactics, yet prove decisive? The answer is that culture shapes how people think, respond, and coordinate. Cultural practices that develop useful capabilities from childhood create advantages that formal training cannot match. American football was such a practice, accidentally creating the psychological and social foundations for military effectiveness while Americans thought they were just playing a game. This realization that the most powerful advantages are often hidden in plain sight, embedded in cultural practices too familiar to notice, applies far beyond military history. In business, education, technology, politics, any domain where human coordination determines success, cultural practices matter more than formal systems. The side that understands this wins. The side that focuses only on visible factors loses, often without understanding why. German prisoners at Camp Carson learned this lesson through bitter experience. They had served in a military with superior weapons, superior tactics, and initially superior training. They lost to an opponent whose advantages lay not in technology, but in culture, not in formal systems, but in informal practices, not in conscious strategy, but in childhood games. The football games they witnessed were not just entertainment for American guards. They were demonstrations of the cultural foundation that made American victory possible. The electromagnetic waves carried by radio equipment may have connected American tanks tactically, but the cultural practices embodied in football connected American soldiers psychologically and socially, creating a force that could not be defeated by superior weapons alone. This was the hidden victory of American football, not in the games themselves, but in the cultural capabilities those games developed, in the psychological foundations they established, in the social practices they promoted. German prisoners at Camp Carson witnessed this victory without fully understanding it. The world continues to learn its lessons. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.